been reading a lot of books about China for a lot of decades. I have to say that this book here is really good. And I think you in many ways, Yasheng, have really given us a wonderful tour through the various decades of sort of Chinese history since Mao's death, and really helped readers to understand, what it is that's going on between the U.S. and China. So let's dive in. The first thing I found really interesting about your book was that you talk a little bit about traditional China. And one of the questions that I've always found interesting is, to what degree has China's sort of old authoritarian dynastic history dovetailed quite neatly with Leninist one-party authoritarianism? And so what's the cultural sort of provenance of China worth in this new kind of a one-party state?
Yeah, so I think there's a ideological cultural affinity between the traditional Chinese political ideology and the communist ideology. In the following sense, both ideologies gave a lot of power and enable the state at the expense of society and independent actors in the society, such as intellectuals, commerce, not so much sort of wiping out commerce, wiping out intellectuals. It is reducing them to their own individual capacity rather than having them as an organized, potentially competitive force with the state. Right? So China has intellectuals, China has entrepreneurs and business people, but mostly they are intellectuals and business people in their own individual capacity, rather than as a part of an organization, as a part of a collective entity that is separate from, independent of the state. Both ideologies are extremely careful about managing the relationship between state and society. Traditional Chinese political culture has very little room for independent society. And I go back to the exam system as a way to make sure that the state dominates the society. The state, so for those who are not familiar with the exam system, so the title is Rise and the Fall of the East. And East, EAST, stands for Exam, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology. So I start with the E, the letter E, the exam, and the exam was the civil service exam, established in 587. And that exam system was extremely powerful in for the state to monopolize the human capital.
And regiment thought.
And regiment thought, that exactly. So even though the state itself was not large, right? So if you look at the exam system, at the end of the system, you had about 400 people that eventually went into the highest level of the imperial bureaucracy. But the exam system was so enjoyed such a large participation from the masses, and unlike SAT, in the U.S., the college,
you actually had to know something.
So I was going to make a different point, which is that in the U.S., you may take SAT once, you may take it twice, but that's about it. To pass the Imperial Service exam, you have to take it multiple times. And we have a database on the exam candidates in the Ming Dynasty. The youngest person who passed the exam was 13 years old, right? So clearly a genius. The oldest was 59, right? So this is Ming Dynasty. This is 400 years ago, 500 years ago, when the life expectancy was probably in the 40s. So you take it multiple times. So in my book, I argued that the state monopolized the best of the human capital. They monopolize the ideology. They also monopolize your time.
And they socialized you into a certain mindset.
Completely. Socialize you into a certain mindset, completely. And so scholars believe that China reflects its own history. That's absolutely true. But I think we have been a little bit vague about exactly what part of the history that the current system reflects. So I pin it down to the exam system. Other people can argue that could be other things. But I think we need to be more specific than just saying that it is a product of history. We need to be very, very concrete when we say, okay, it's part of that history. And the exam system has survived into these days.
Right, the Gaokao.
The Gaokao and the civil service exam, and also the entire meritocracy, right? The idea of meritocracy, there are different ideas about what meritocracy is. My own definition of meritocracy is that you promote, you reward people on the basis of objective metrics, right? It could be GDP, it could be something else. Exam system was meritocratic in the sense that you got promoted on your exam performance. During much of the time since 1978, the Chinese system relied on GDP as a performance metric. So in that sense, it was meritocratic. I'm not saying it is necessarily good. It's just saying that there is an objective measure.
Yeah, yeah. You had this millennial-long system of Confucian classical education, which enabled you to take and maybe pass the exam, get into the bureaucracy, and that was sort of a way to create a common culture, and also it was like a propaganda bureau in a certain sense. So then along comes Lenin in 1921, when Sun Yat-sen gets interested in how to build a party, and the nationalists and the communists both adopt Lenin. So do you think Lenin would have been as digestible to China if they hadn't had this past?
Well, so I think what Leninist ideology did to China was that they further empowered this traditional preference and traditional endowment of political authority by adding to that political authority control of the economy. At least in the traditional Chinese society, you didn't have the state controlling the economy to the extent that the central planning system did. So it kind of moved the system even further in the direction of the control by the state than it would have been if they just rely on the traditional political system. Right? So I would argue that nationalist government relied on the traditional model. There you had definitely authoritarianism, but a mixture of private economy and strong government. And over time in Taiwan, they began to open up. Whereas in mainland China, you had the elements of the Leninist ideology and then the traditional ideology, and they complemented with each other. One is more on the political side, the other is on the economic side.
So here's a question that I've always vexed over, an economic question. I mean, you had a traditional system which for many centuries disesteemed commerce.
Yeah.
I mean, in the hierarchy of things, the merchants
Yeah.
are at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Strangely, in traditional Chinese culture, that it was the scholars, the learned people
Yeah.
who were esteemed. And in a communist system, of course, the merchants, the bourgeoisie,
Yeah.
the entrepreneurs are also disesteemed.
Yeah,
disesteemed.
they're scums.
They're
yeah.
scum.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
To quote it from a Republican candidate. Yeah.
so how did we, and then I want to get you to kind of look through the various decades at how things have really changed in
Yeah.
China, but how the heck did we get to this place where Chinese are suddenly these celebrated entrepreneurs?
Yeah.
I mean, talk about
Until
Yeah,
until Xi Jinping.
Until
yeah.
Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
exactly. But there have been a number of decades where they were the envy of the world.
Well, so the key thing that changed was the goal changed, right? So the goal for imperial regimes was political stability, political control. It was never about economics. In fact, the chapter on technology shows that even though China was extraordinarily inventive, there was never really any kind of technological agenda on the part of the government. It really just happened that way. And then they lost it completely after they introduced the exam system. And the economic development was never really a concern on the part of the imperial regimes until the Opium War, because they got hit so badly by the imperialist powers. And then Deng Xiaoping came along in 1978, and he engineered, I would argue, a ideological revolution, right? Not in the sense of, toward democracy, constitutional democracy, but this idea that the goal of the government is to develop the economy. That just opened up.
So describe what preceded that. I mean, most people understand the Maoist revolution, but that certainly was not about getting rich.
Maoist revolution?
Yeah. I mean,
absolutely. It was.
And then let's talk about what Deng did and what that meant in terms of revolution of its own kind.
So Mao's revolution was not about getting rich, but it was about getting the country to be strong. So there's that differentiation between kind of individual wealth accumulation that we typically associate with capitalism, and the kind of the power of the country, the power of the state. Yeah, the fuqiang.
Wealth and power.
I mean, it's sort of wealth and power, right? So it could be military power, it could be economic power, but that didn't work, right? Central planning failed miserably, and Mao didn't help. I mean, he launched Cultural Revolution, he launched Great Leap Forward that further damaged the economy. So essentially, by the late 1970s, central planning was ideologically bankrupt, and they needed a new method of developing the economy. And that's when the market economy idea began to sort of reluctantly adopted by the Chinese Communist Party. And Deng Xiaoping really meant it when he said that doesn't matter the color of the mice as long as they can catch the. Oh, that's right. Yeah, the cat. Yeah. In my household, it's the other way around. Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, that's right. It doesn't matter the color of the cat as long as they can catch the mice. And so that's a really, really revolutionary idea, right?
Would you say that, I mean, when Deng Xiaoping came on the scene, and remember, he had been cashiered twice and had been totally humiliated, sent down, and ignored. So he came back into power. Do you think that his genius was that he actually believed that we had to have more incentives and innovation and capitalist impulse? Or do you think he kind of just let the pressure off, and things sort of started to develop.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter.
Yeah.
Right. So it is not a sort of a story about heroic leader imposing market economy on the Chinese. My own view of market economy capitalism is it is more consistent with human nature than socialism. Right? So essentially, if you leave the human beings alone, they tend to go capitalistic rather than socialistic. So the issue here is more about removing the barriers, removing the obstacles toward basic human nature. And Deng, the genius of Deng was, well, it's not so much the genius of Deng, it is really the unique aspect of Deng was that he had the credibility. Precisely because he was purged twice by Mao. So when the Chinese peasants saw that Deng came back, they really believed that the world had changed, right? So for many, many years, academics are puzzled by this phenomenon of incredible entrepreneurship bursting out in China.
First in the countryside.
First in the countryside, for sure, right? But under one-party autocracy, without rule of law, without free press, without all these niceties that we associate with a democratic system, and some argue that, that means that the democracies are not necessary, rule of law is not necessary. But we have to remember, though, we shouldn't look at this issue from the perspective of those of us who live in a democracy. We have to look at this issue from the perspective of these rural entrepreneurs in 1977, 1978. To them, Deng Xiaoping now coming back to Beijing and taking over the government, to that rural entrepreneur, that could be a difference between Stalinist Russia and Jeffersonian America, right? So, I mean, to him or her, this is a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that Mao Zedong had communized the entire country, taken all private property away, all private homes, and suddenly this guy, Deng Xiaoping, appears, and you start getting people getting rights to farm land. They can have their own house, they can raise a chicken, a pig, and take it to market.
That's, so just imagine that you have been socialized to a world where even raising your chicken is capitalistic. Yeah. And you can go to prison. And from that to a world where, raising chicken is okay. That's a huge difference.
Within a couple of years.
Within a couple of years, right? So, so in my book, I talk about, because economists, talk about incentives. Never underestimate the power of the incentive effect of not getting arrested. Right? That's incentive right there.
Pretty basic.
It's pretty
starting
basic
place for an incentive.
And I think so. At that time, it was the fact that you no longer face imprisonment that enabled you and to go into entrepreneurship. Today, I think we have to talk about rule of law because you have amassed billions of dollars of assets. You have built an entrepreneurial empire. Then you can't just say, okay, I'm not going to arrest you. Then you say, I feel so good. I'm not arrested, so I work hard to create technology. Today, you kind of have to introduce rule of law.
Okay, now we're getting ahead of ourselves a little here. I want to sort of take you down through the...
I'm impatient, yes.
So then if we sort of go through your chapters, which sort of document the different periods, which are quite extraordinary. They're almost like dynasties, characteristic in very distinctive ways. So the 80s, by your account, and I would agree with you, it was a pretty extraordinary time. So describe why you felt it was such an amazing time, and how does it counterpose against what preceded?
One reason it was amazing is because I was a young person then. So
did you get sent to the countryside?
No. I wasn't old enough to be sent to the countryside. So that was nice. But other than that, it was in doing the research for this book, I found out lots of things about the 1980s that I didn't know about before. What I knew before was in the 80s, the economic development, the economic growth. By the way, in the 1980s, the Chinese GDP growth and other measures of the development are no less impressive as compared with later decades. Arguably, they are even more impressive as compared with later decades. So incredible economic growth, and in fact, income inequality began to decline in the 1980s. So on the economic side, you have really just remarkable economic performance. On the intellectual side, that was the time, you wrote about this, right? That was a time when the intellectuals were really free to explore many ideas that they were not able to before, and even many ideas they are not able to explore even today.
Right.
And intellectuals criticized Deng Xiaoping by name, right? Liu Bingyan and Fang Lizhi and people like
Democracy
that.
Wall.
Democracy Wall, right? It was shut down for sure, but it never really went away in other ways, manifested in other ways. So those things we know because scholars have done research on these issues. What I didn't quite know before is that the political structure was also quite fragmented. So at one point in the 1980s, the political power was divided among 5 individuals. The secretary, general secretary of the Communist Party is one individual. The president of the country is another individual. Chairman of the Military Affairs Commission is another individual. The premier is another individual. And then there is an institution called the Central Advisory Commission, and that's another power center.
Which got abolished.
Which got abolished after 1989. So, these are not like separation of power and constitutional division of labor, but to have institutional separations, the minimum condition is that you have separation of individuals, right? So 5 individuals holding 5 different positions of power, I consider that as the beginning of possible evolution toward an institutional separation of power. So politically, we for the 1980s, many people think about Deng Xiaoping, and they think Deng Xiaoping as a strong man, and that's actually not true. Deng Xiaoping compromised on many, many issues. Deng Xiaoping had to make concessions to Chen Yun and to many other conservatives in the party and to the military. And then on his left, he had these party ideologues, economic conservatives. On his right, he had, fairly radical reformers, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, who advocated both economic and political reforms. And Deng was right in the middle, and he had to kind of navigate the political forces from the left and from the right. So that was the landscape of Chinese politics in the 1980s.
So there was a kind of a factional check and balance system.
So essentially, it's a de facto check and balance, not necessarily according to the rules and regulations, but still, some check and balance is better than none, right? So China already began to have a de facto check and balance political dynamics, not political system, but political dynamics. That all went out of the window because of Tiananmen. Right, so
okay, but before we get to Tiananmen, we're going to get there. I want to keep order here in the court. I want you to just to remind everybody that not only was this a time of immense economic sort of ferment, but it was also a time of incredible intellectual, artistic. In fact, I think the first time I met you, Yasheng, was at a weird rock concert with Sui Jian.
Yeah, that was Sui Jian.
So this is this guy who used to play trumpet in the Beijing Philharmonic. And he went off the reservation, grew long hair, got a band with a Hungarian guy, an American guy. And he was sort of the first efflorescence of cosmopolitan pop culture. So they had this weird thing in the middle of the night, as I remember, with fires burning off, and I ran into you there. But it was a kind of an emblem of the sort of incredible sort of artistic and intellectual ferment. So describe that.
Well, so Sui Jian, I didn't talk about him in the book, but I should have. Sui Jian was a rock and roll star. A lot of his songs were political, overtly political, right? Against authority, against not against Chinese Communist Party per se, but the against the idea of political authority dictating everyday life, right? Kind of the rebellious spirit that is fairly common among rock and roll. Rock and roll music. And he was the first rock and roll star in China, and he was worshipped by the young people. And he played a pretty important role in the Tiananmen demonstration.
He played at the monument.
Yeah. And also there were art exhibits. I remember visiting these art exhibits, and there's one very famous art exhibit. The title of the exhibit is No U-Turn, right? It is the idea is that we don't want to go back to Cultural Revolution. A lot of the paintings and the exhibits, again, have an overt political tone. I remember actually a few years ago when I visited the Modern Museum in New York. It's not Tate, but there's another one, and I forgot the name. They had the Chinese art exhibition. It's very interesting that they had the paintings and exhibits from China divided by decades, 1980s, 1990s, and then 2000s. In the 1980s, the paintings and the exhibits, more or less all of them were about politics.
Yeah, and they were using a lot of Maoist iconography, making fun of it, spoofing it.
That's right, yeah. And then after 1989, gradually these exhibits express economic ideas. Right? So pivoting, so essentially this is the divide between 1980s and 1990s. I mean,
they had to vacate
the politics.
And
now economics became the reigning ideology. So I remember vividly seeing that exhibit, and which is very consistent with what I experienced. And there was another art exhibit I remember. I wasn't there at the time this happened. One artist had a pistol, and she shot herself in the mirror. So the kind of performance artist.
Well, that was at the Central Art Museum.
Central Art Museum.
Shut down.
Yeah. So I mean, that was pretty extreme, right? And then there were also protests by the students in 1986. And then on university campuses, they had many discussions about politics, about Taiwan model, about Japan model. And they had local elections at the village level, also in Beijing, at the district level, in the university district, Haidian district. They had university students campaigning for the district legislature. And then So just imagine maybe Manhattan, you call it borough?
Yeah, or the city council, the boroughs, yeah.
Boroughs,
yeah.
okay, borough councilors,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Campaigning for that seat. And then you go to these debate. They're debating Rousseau, and they're debating Fabian socialism. You wouldn't do that if the objective is just to land a seat at the borough council. It was just incredible, and some of them got elected. And so it was a very open era, politically, artistically, and intellectually. And another interesting thing about the era is that was all before the internet, for sure, right? 1980s. Official media, People's Daily, sometimes you will see two editorials opposite of each other, printed on the same page, arguing against each other, right? About the pros and cons of certain issues. You would also see government officials coming out and apologize for the wrong things that they did. You also see the peasants suing the local government for taking off their land and won the lawsuit, right? It was an incredible era. And many young people in China have no idea that was how China began its economic takeoff. So in my book, I argued that political liberalization, even though China didn't transition to a democracy, we shouldn't understate the degree of political liberalization in the 1980s, and we shouldn't understate the contribution of political liberalization to economic liberalization.
That's an important point, that the two do have a kind of a symbiosis.
They are symbiotic relationship with each other. They complement with each other. So you may say, oh, what's the big deal about that perspective? Many people believe you need an autocrat to enforce economic reforms. Right? When Xi Jinping came into power, that's how people thought. We need an autocrat to start and to deepen economic reform. Many respectable economists would make that point of view. Many respectable scholars would argue that position. Historical evidence, I believe, is squarely on the opposite. Right? A more liberal political system, you have more liberal economy. A more illiberal political system, you have a more illiberal economy.
Yeah, it's sort of, you can't have one without the other.
They have to go together. That's what Zhao Ziyang argued.
Yeah.
That's what Hu Yaobang argued, and they're absolutely right.
Okay, so now we can come to 1989. So here's my question for you. You all remember what happened, this incredible outburst of sort of populist sentiment and free speech and one thing or another that filled Tiananmen Square for 7 weeks with 1 million people sometimes. And it was the most extraordinary, I think, period of history that I've actually sort of lived in and through. Do you think if that hadn't happened, which effectively ended this very golden period that you've just described, do you think then reform might have worked and the Communist Party might have slowly been reformed out of its position of unilateral power?
Yeah, so that's a counterfactual question, right? So we know the history that happened. We don't know the history that could have happened, but didn't. My answer to that is yes. So it's not just Tiananmen per se. It is the manner with which Tiananmen was ended, right? So this violent crackdown. And that finished off this kind of gradual opening of Chinese politics, the fragmentation of the political structure, and a demolished one part of the Chinese Communist Party, represented by Zhao Ziyang.
Who was a very liberal, open, first premier and then party general secretary.
That's right. And somebody who believed that the best thing to do is to open up both politics and economic system gradually, which would enable social forces, independent social forces, commercial development, and society to emerge over time. That's basically East Asian model, right? That's how Taiwan transitioned to democracy. That's how South Korea transitioned to democracy. If Tiananmen didn't happen, I'm not going to say if Tiananmen didn't happen, China today is a constitutional democracy. But I'm pretty sure it is going to be far more open, both politically and economically. And by the way, it is going to be a China that has a far better relationship with the West than the China we actually have.
So 1989, in effect, then, is what you're suggesting triggered those incipient, latent forces of autocracy and one-party rule, which were always there, and allowed them to come back in a way that we've never quite recovered from.
So Tiananmen, to be fair to the post-Tiananmen leadership, they didn't reverse economic reforms. They continue with economic reforms. They reverse some of the economic reforms, but then we're getting into the sort of operational details. But by and large, they privatized the economy. They opened up the Chinese economy to the World Trade Organization, right? So all these things that they did in the 1990s. But they reversed every single political reform from the 1980s. So I compare the economic changes to physical changes in the nature, right? So you can go far in terms of making physical changes, but the physical changes can change back. The political changes, I compare
particularly since the structure didn't change.
The structure, yeah. So
the one-party
political
government.
Exactly. So that's the chemical change that they didn't institute. So they essentially reversed the chemical changes. They went pretty far in physical changes, right? They went pretty far. So let's give them credit for that. But the possibility of going back, the possibility of reversion has always been there because they didn't undertake political reforms. And again, maybe today people say, oh, what's the big surprise from that? Well, it's a big surprise to a lot of scholars. In the 1990s and 2000s, a lot of scholars believe that all you need is economic reforms. All you need is economic development. Then economic development, this is engagement policy.
Yeah,
right?
will then push the political.
That's exactly the assumption of the engagement policy, which is that as long as economic changes are happening, that's okay. It's a one-party system, autocracy is okay, because it's going to flip, right? I mean, Clinton...
Peaceful evolution.
Peaceful revolution and evolution. And Bill Clinton made that argument explicitly in 1993, right? As a justification why U.S. should grant China the WTO and MFN, the most favored nation trading status. That was made as an explicit part of the U.S. strategy, which is economics is going to result to political changes. Now we know that didn't work out.
Well, the Germans had a version of this. What was it? Wandel der Handel?
My German is a little bit rusty. I don't. Yeah.
What is it? Wandel der Handel. That through trade you'll have change. Yeah.
Well, Hitler. Yeah, you got it. You got him. Yeah. So and in my book, I went into some details looking at Taiwan and South Korea. Again, these are things I didn't know before. So there was a simplistic idea that the political changes there were result of economic development, right? South Korea became rich.
It's very Marxist in a way, wasn't it? Because
it is a Marxist.
Marx adopted from Hegel this notion that history had a direction and things followed automatically.
Yeah. So and it's kind of the material base of super infrastructure, right? It's a very Marxian view, and ironically, adopted by many capitalist leaders.
But unconsciously.
Unconsciously, yeah. So we shouldn't give them that credit for understanding Marxism. And so I looked at some details of Taiwan and South Korea. It was not at all only because of economics. They had political reforms too. They had partial opening of the media. The Korean national legislature was always competitive. Even under martial law, they had, elections. They had presidential elections that were semi-decent. Taiwanese provincial legislature was always competitive, and in terms of elections. The national legislature was not, right? Because the KMT still used the old seats from the mainland to assign seats at the national legislature.
They had to find two guys from Xinjiang.
Yeah, that's right. So it's over time it became more and more difficult. But at the provincial level, it was always competitive. There was far more press freedom than there was in the 1990s on mainland China. So the political opening in South Korea, they had unions, they had independent unions, labor unions, they had independent student unions. Unions launched strikes all the time. Student unions demonstrated all the time. None of that you had in China after 1989.
So that was one of the big demands in 1989 was a student union.
That's right. That was one of the formal demands for the government to recognize the independence of the student union. But South Korea had that, right? So, and the U.S., let's not underestimate the role of the U.S. in directly helping South Korea become democratic. President Carter intervened many, many times when South Korea arrested dissidents. The Constitution of South Korea was written by a Harvard political scientist, Rupert Emerson. And so the interactions with the West were always there, influencing. And let's also point out, South Korean society was 30% Catholic, right? So the religion played a very big role. So it was quite diverse compared with China in the 1990s. And we ignore all of that. And then we pin every hope, political hope, on one thing, which is economic development, trade, and foreign direct investment.
Yeah, in fact, the odd thing is, Yasheng, I'm sure you'd agree that the logic of engagement when it started, although we didn't call it that, was let's gang up against the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and we had to repurpose engagement with the new rationale. The new rationale was trade will equal openness.
Yeah, so you could argue that it was the rationale that you had to invoke because the strategic rationale disappeared, right? Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and essentially you didn't have to use China as a counterbalancing force against Soviet Union. Then you invented this rationale. But the rationale was not completely artificial. Many people, I believe in it at the time. And
I think I did now, but I'm not sure then, but I'm not sure I do now. What do you think?
Well, I don't, but on the other hand, I think if there's nothing left, then if economics is the only thing that's left, then we have to rely on it. But then we just have to be realistic.
Didn't stop World War I.
Sadly, yeah. True.
All right, so since time is advancing here, so then we end up with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, where, as you point out, and some very interesting chapters here in the book on this, reform didn't completely end. Things opened up again. China joined the world system, economics and trade. So what happened when Xi Jinping arrives? What's going on here, and why did it happen?
Yeah. So there's a political story and there's an economic story. Let me tell the political story first. One of the things that happened, so I basically trace everything to Tiananmen, right? On the political
as a tipping point.
As a tipping point, as a tipping point. As a point that incubated a lot of the later dynamics. So one of the things that happened after Tiananmen was Deng and other revolutionary elders decided to strengthen the power of the general secretary of the Communist Party. They essentially demolished this fragmented structure they themselves created. And the reason is very straightforward. The party secretary, Zhao Ziyang, was sacked. This is a guy who engineered the rural revolution in Sichuan province. This is a person who implemented industrial and rural reforms throughout the 1980s, basically responsible for the Chinese economic takeoff.
Pulled the Communist Party cells out of all of the businesses.
He also separated the party and the state, right? He implemented political reforms. An extremely smart person, and Milton Friedman met with him and later said that he has never met a political leader who really intuitively understood market economics, right? So this is a guy who never spent a day in college. And also, like many liberal reformers, he was not into prosecuting other people. He was not into power struggles. He was really interested deeply in ideas and genuinely interested in improving the welfare of the Chinese people. So he was gone because of Tiananmen. Now you had this leader from Shanghai, Jiang Zemin. And how should I put it?
Everybody thought he was a little clownish at the time, but I must say I have a different view now as I look back.
Well, but the thing, you may be influenced by Xi Jinping, though. So I think, yeah, it's a little bit like our view of George W. Bush, right? And
yeah.
But remember, Jiang Zemin came from Shanghai. Shanghai was, in the 1980s, the least reformed part of China. And Jiang Zemin's economic performance was mediocre. His political performance was mostly about controlling the demonstration in 1989.
Which he did.
Which he did. He diffused the situation in Shanghai. That was about it. I mean, compare with a person who engineered the rural revolution in China, pulled China from poverty, right? Now you have this guy who had no political credentials in the capital of China, who didn't really know other leaders. You sort of put him in charge because
it was sort of a desperate choice.
It was a desperate.
Yeah, had to come up with someone.
No, Deng Xiaoping said it, although I didn't find the documentary confirmation of this. Deng Xiaoping said, "We look left, we look right. Oh, nobody sort of stood out. Okay, let's just give it to him." That was pretty casual, right? And so now you have him. So the elders were terribly worried about his weakness. So what do? You strengthen his position. You gave the general secretary position to him. You also gave the presidency to him. So remember I talked about 5 centers of power?
Right.
So now you combine two. You got rid of the Central Advisory Commission because this is an institution that had the retired leaders who had a habit of intervening in the affairs of the government. You don't want them. You got rid of that. You also gave him the military. So he now was the president, the general secretary, and the chairman of the Military Affairs Commission. And now you also got rid of the advisory commission. You basically transition the country from a 5-power structure to a 2-power structure.
Yeah, the premier.
The premier, that's all you have. And that was the system that persisted until Xi Jinping, right?
So it was a kind of a halfway house.
It's a halfway house
to more centralized power.
And the most important change, I would argue, of the changes they made was the abolition of the Central Advisory Commission that had retired leaders. So this is the argument I make in my book, which is that in an autocracy, the only people the current autocrat is accountable to are his predecessors. So, nobody else has that kind of power, right? The only people who have that power are the people who kind of incubate you, who nominate you, who appoint you. The Central Advisory Commission essentially is an institutional base of the retired leaders. If it had existed, they could have exercised that power. By 2012, that was gone.
Yeah, as Deng Xiaoping did.
Deng Xiaoping, yeah. So you may ask, well, but that was gone in 1989. What about the previous years? In the previous years, Deng was still okay. He was still alive. He died in 1997. So he essentially exercised some constraint on Jiang Zemin from 1989 to 1997. And then Jiang Zemin stepped down in 2002, and he persisted. So we all remember that very well, right? Hu Jintao didn't really have much power. So essentially, you have a de facto division of labor by biology, by human biology, rather than by institutions. Deng Xiaoping checked and balanced the power of Jiang Zemin. The famous southern trip Deng Xiaoping made in 1992 was basically a balancing act on Jiang Zemin because he felt Jiang Zemin was not sufficiently reforming the economy. He had to go to Shenzhen and said, if you don't reform the economy, you should get out, right? And by 2012, Jiang Zemin was too old. He was 86, 87. Deng already died a long time ago. And Hu Jintao, for whatever reasons, decided, I'm fed up with politics. I'm just going to go and fishing, and I'm done. So he stopped himself from exercising that regency power. So all that check and balance was left to the biology of these predecessors, as well as to their individual preferences. Had an institution such as Central Advisory Commission existed, it would have exercised that power. And I believe that, Xi Jinping could still become the party secretary in 2012, but I don't think he will get away with revision of the term limits.
So when you look at him, it's just as a person who has certain experiences and acts in certain ways, what do you think he's up to? What's important to him? Why is he antagonizing so many countries abroad, so many elements of Chinese society, and you catalog it very nicely in your book. What the hell's going on?
Yeah, so we know what he has done, and nobody knows why.
What do you think?
So I don't think it has to happen that way. I think this is sort of evolution by different stages. I think what surprised him was how easy he got away with all of that.
But why did he want to?
Well, I think so. Let me come back to the economic story. I just told the political story. On the economic side, by 2012, China was deeply corrupt, deeply corrupt, crony capitalism. And that was also Tiananmen. In my book, I show the data that corruption increased dramatically after Tiananmen. Tiananmen basically wiped out a social movement for clean government, right? The student demonstrators who demonstrated for clean government, the leaders of the movement were arrested. Zhao Ziyang was sacked. He called for investigations of Politburo members for corruption, including starting with his own family. He was sacked. That was basically an open invitation to corruption, right? Yeah, you can now do whatever. So corruption increased dramatically since 1989. By 2012, there was a genuine sense among the society, among the political elites, economic elites, intellectual elites, you got to deal with corruption, right? But there are two different ways to deal with corruption. Most of us at that time believed that the way to deal with corruption was to open up the media, to introduce transparency, to introduce rule of law. But many Chinese didn't share that perspective. They saw the urgency of corruption, but then they believed that the right way to do that is to arrest corrupt officials. I remember vividly in 2014, a prominent magazine in China invited me and a number of scholars to a conference discussing corruption. And the organizers of the conference asked us the following question: how do we get rid of the corruption without getting rid of the system? Most of us at the conference believed that we couldn't do that.
Well, you actually believe that corruption makes the system work.
No, so that's why you kind of have to
keep it.
Well, you keep it and then you continue to be corrupt, or you reform the system, introducing transparency, introducing rule of law as a way to deal with corruption. But obviously that was not the solution they settled upon. The solution they settled upon was massive campaign against corruption. The problem with that approach is it was always going to be contaminated by political objective, right? In many ways, it is one stone that kills two birds, multiple birds. You want to get rid of your political opponents. And by the way, the first opponent that he got rid of was the opponent favored by his predecessors, right? So going back to my argument that you fear the predecessors the most. You got rid of corruption and you got rid of the political opposition simultaneously. And you strengthen your power simultaneously. To a rational autocrat, that is the preferred solution, right? To people like me, we would argue, no, you actually need to give up power. You need to introduce transparency as a way to deal with corruption. That solution goes, I argue it's a better solution in terms of corruption, but it is a worse solution from the perspective of the autocrat, right? So I think it's gradual. And I think he might have been surprised by how easy it was for him.
What do you think impelled him to go on this route?
Well, so I do believe there was an objective ground to tackle corruption in 2012, if not earlier. Corruption was so bad, right? So there was an objective ground to deal with the issue. I don't blame him for having that policy objective. The trouble I have is this particular manner with which this particular solution that he settled upon, that in effect led to the strengthening of the autocracy, led to more accumulation of the power in the government. These are precisely the reasons the system is corrupt in the first place. right? So it is like going back to the cat analogy. Hopefully, I'll get it right this time. So the cat chasing his own tail, right? It is a kind of a perennial, forever movement that you can never succeed. So look at what is happening now, right? 10 years after, 11 years after the corruption campaign, you're still chasing after corrupt officials. You're still sacking this person for corruption, that person for corruption.
I think you write that there 4 million people have been.
4 million people.
That's a lot of people to have in jail.
And also the other problem with that strategy is, by definition, the corrupt people are powerful people because they use their political power to accumulate wealth. And then you antagonize the powerful people. Powerful people like me, right? Not very powerful person, have family, friends. You multiply that 4 million by 4, you got 16 million people, right? You antagonize 16 million people, 20 million people by this strategy. Do you ever want to give up your power once you have offended so many people?
But there's a prior question I want you to answer, and that is, why do it in the first place? Why alienate 60 million people in China and alienate half of the world outside with your diplomacy?
So this is where ideology really matters, right? So you could have tackle the corruption issue through this democratic, like Zhao Ziyang. I mean, Zhao Ziyang was arguing for more transparency in the media, and he
allowed it.
He allowed it, and he also proposed to the Politburo that the Politburo members are going to be required to disclose their assets. Right? Imagine putting that provision in 1989, right? Things would have been different. You could have gone down on that path, right? And a lot of people had a high hope that he would, because of his father, because of his own experience in the Cultural Revolution, right? He suffered, his family suffered. But he didn't, right? So it has to be because of his idea. Right? The idea is that the right way to tackle corruption is to increase my power.
And control.
And control. Increase my power, increase my control, right? And, you know, I think this is the tragedy of that system. The system requires a visionary leader who truly has innovative ideas, but the system typically doesn't provide that kind of leader. Zhao Ziyang was so rare. Hu Yaobang was so rare. Deng Xiaoping, to some extent, was also rare, right? Kind of Xi Jinping is more normal, actually. It just, the difference
he's
between...
Brezhnev, really.
It's a Brezhnev, and the difference between Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao didn't believe opening up, right, as a way to deal with corruption. They also believe in cracking down, except that they didn't go all the way to the logical conclusion of the anti-corruption campaign the way that Xi Jinping did. Directionally, I don't see any difference among these three leaders, the post-Tiananmen leaders. I don't see a single difference in terms of the direction. I see the difference in terms of the willingness to go so far, right? Xi Jinping there is exceptional. And that's something we had no idea about.
All right, listen, there's a lot more to chew on here, but let's take some questions from you. There's a microphone, so raise your hand, one here and one over there. Pardon? Yes, have the microphone, yeah. And introduce yourself, and let's make our questions brief and to the point.
Hello, my name is Tuka. I am a student in Government Politics China, Hunter College, with Professor Yasheng Huang. My question that I pose is, do you think Tiananmen and the tightening control of the CCP proved effective for countering the West, since perhaps open democracy and political activity can make China susceptible to being taken advantage of? I compare this to what happened to Libya under the Gaddafi regime, since counter-revolutionaries leading counter-revolutionary activities against the Gaddafi regime led to a politically broken country, and open talk without scrutiny by Gaddafi led the U.S. to counteract the regime to its destruction. Libya in turn faced many challenges in the country. Could the prevention of the Tiananmen or could the protests have been handled differently, and in turn could this open democracy strengthen China's position or weaken it?
So could Tiananmen been handled differently?
Yeah, so let me stay away from the Gaddafi part of the question. So let me focus on Tiananmen. Yes, it could have been handled differently. You were there, I was there. Essentially, by June 2nd, by June 1st, the crowd on Tiananmen was already pretty thin. It was getting very hot because the summer was arriving. And if the government chose to wait it out, that would be a solution. You know, I don't know how to characterize that solution, kind of by attrition, right? So essentially you're waiting it out. So that's one scenario that could have happened. The other scenario was, and there I blame the students. The students persisted in a way that was simply naive and counterproductive. They didn't understand the dynamics among the Chinese leaders.
Well, they thought they might win.
Yeah,
naively.
but I think naivete was driving it, and you know, a system that has thousands of years of autocracy behind it is not a system that is going to give in so easily, and the government then already gave in to a far greater extent than we could have reasonably expected. But the students persisted and driving out basically Zhao Ziyang, losing the one part of the political establishment that could have reformed the system gradually and in a less violent manner. And I was there, and I also tried to talk to the students and try to reason with them about this dynamic. Didn't succeed at all.
Well, there are a lot of new students coming in too. You know.
Yeah. So yeah, there were new students coming in, and they wanted to participate in this experience. I think we really need to think about these mass movements. They don't have a coherent strategy. They don't have a good tactic. They often are the worst enemy to their own causes. And I characterize the Hong Kong movement that way. You know, so they got a lot of concessions from the Hong Kong government, but they still persisted. Nobody can argue with a straight face that Hong Kong today is better than Hong Kong in 2019, right? So if you are willing to go into a mass movement, you got to be strategic. You got to think about your long-term objective and vis-a-vis the satisfaction of the short-term satisfaction.
Of course, they had no Mao Zedong to lead the mass movement. It was inchoate.
Yeah, it was inchoate, and you know, this is probably the price that you pay for in autocracy. You don't have this tradition of social movement, organization, and society.
So there's a kind of a tragic element here that
there's a tragic element
that was justified in many ways, ended the greatest promise of a transition for China.
Yeah.
Okay, right here.
To Professor Huang several years ago. I'm just a fan of him. Thank you for the talk tonight. I learned a lot. However, as a very young participant back in 1989, I cannot fully digest what you said about Tiananmen tonight. The pill is too big to swallow. My question is, if this kind of bottom-up social movement started from young people was the wrong path for China back in 1989, I guess something similar like the white paper movement last year wasn't the right path either. When you talk about strategic movement, the example I think first was the one started in probably more than 100 years ago, started by Sun Zhongshan, but it was initiated overseas. So in your opinion, for China, does China still have a chance to become open, modern society with democracy? And if that could happen, what would be the right pathway?
Yeah. So let me first draw a sharp distinction between 1989 and the white paper movement. In 1989, you had a divided government. The reformers would have gained the upper hand if the students collaborated, either explicitly or implicitly with the reformers. That's not a scenario in 2022 with the white paper movement. Now you have, basically a single autocrat. There's no visible division among the top leadership. So there's no opportunity to use the kind of strategy I was talking about in 2022. And so that's one big difference between the two. And the other big difference is that the white paper, I wouldn't call it movement. Tiananmen was the movement. The white paper was a protest. It was a grievance-based protest against the specific policies of zero COVID controls. Whereas 1989 was much bigger and it was idea-based. And I would not put 1989, I would not put the 2022 protest at the same level as 1989 was much deeper, much deeper. Right?
And strangely, it was deeper against a reform-minded government, which we now lament its passing.
The objective effect of that. So I don't cripple with their ideals, right? I don't cripple with their motivations. But let's just be honest. The objective, the result of that movement was reformist leaders were demolished. And that was because of failure to understand the complexities of the Chinese political system and political dynamics. I don't think, I'm being sort of unfair. It's hard to argue that the leaders that came after 1989 were better for democratic prospect of China than the leaders before it, right? So, again, student movement is student movement, right? So they tend to behave that way. But I think we need to think really hard in a society such as China. I'm not against the movement itself. What I'm critical of is lack of strategy and lack of complexity in the way that they approach the political dynamics.
Okay, one more question? Yes.
Yeah, Peter Walker, made a lot of trips to China over the years. My question is, to what extent do you believe that the Chinese system is gradually self-correcting? So if I take 3 data points, one is what happened in zero COVID, where it really changed overnight. And then the second one was the early push in favor of SOEs at the expense of private enterprise. That seems to be swinging back as the government realizes that economically that's a bad call. And then politically, if you look at the early handling of Australia, which a lot of people felt was bully-like, and now it seems to be much more congenial, obviously different players involved. So one view of the current government is they're going down a learning curve and they're correcting their mistakes.
Yeah.
A different view is this is just noise along the way. Nothing fundamental is changing. So I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Good question.
Yeah, I actually think it's neither. Neither of the two scenarios you laid out. First, let's just get the fact right about the lifting of the COVID controls. The virus was already spreading. So it was no longer effective. All the quarantine measures that they put in place were absolutely not effective. And they had to lift the controls, not because of some intellectual recognition of the shortcomings of the measures. That should have been there a long time ago, because every public health expert will tell you this method was absolutely not effective against Omicron variant of COVID-19 virus. Right? So I think we need to be precise in our semantics. I wouldn't call that self-correction when the thing that you try to contain is already spreading, community spreading in a community. The other two examples, so if you believe that's learning, then the assumption there is these are some stupid people we're talking about, right? So Australia is the biggest supplier of the iron ore to China. And to cut off the supplies of iron ore to your country, it is going to have an incredibly negative effect on your economy, which it did. And especially because the iron ore from Australia is much more clean than the iron ore that China can produce itself, right? It has, so in terms of environment, in terms of climate, the Australian iron ore is much better than the Chinese iron ore. So not recognizing that having a bad relationship, so as soon as they began to cut off the imports from Australia, they were running shortages of electricity. In some regions of the country, they began to shut down electricity, right? So, again, self-learning usually, in my own mind, is that there's new information and you revise your policy because you have new data, you have new information. But the knowledge is all along there, right? It's just as simple as if I stop eating for 3 days, I'm pretty confident I'm going to get hungry, right? So it doesn't take self-learning to actually start for 3 days to realize, oh, actually I need to eat, right? On the SOE point, there's 30 years of research to show that favoring SOEs is going to be very bad for your economy. Every single academic study shows that SOEs have lower productivity and have very, very bad loan performance. That you still favor SOE, and then you correct that policy because when you favor the SOE, you get exactly the same results as you have before, right? Do I call that self-learning? I don't know. I mean, they have learned that so many times since 1978. Anytime after Tiananmen in 1989, they began to favor SOEs.
Okay,
I think I'm an academic, so I care about the words that I use. I wouldn't describe those as supporting examples of self-learning.
So that has some relevance to the last question I want to throw at you, self-learning. If you had to place your money on reform or regime change, where would you come down?
I still want, in terms of my subjective preference, I want to see reforms.
Do you think it's possible?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible.
With Xi Jinping, or do you think we have to wait him out?
Well, okay, so let me lay out the following dynamic. I think the reforms are still possible because there's a fundamental difference between Xi Jinping, the era of Xi Jinping, and the person of Xi Jinping, between that and the era of Mao Zedong and the person of Mao Zedong in the following sense. During the Mao era, Chinese economy didn't grow, right? So that we know. But Mao didn't spend a lot of money either. Right? He had satellite, he has some of these things. So essentially, if you don't have a lot of money coming in, that's okay if you don't spend a lot of money, right? I mean, basically, that's how a lot of poor people live. The problem arises when you spend a lot of money, but you don't earn it. I will characterize that as the current situation in China. Look at his programs. Belt and Road, semiconductor self-reliance, the big urbanization programs, the social transfer programs that he has, right? So essentially, to use academic language, that's a definition of disequilibria. Because you are spending a lot of money, but you're not earning money, right? And whereas the previous leadership, they also spend a lot of money. So let's be clear that the semiconductor industrial policy has always been there. Chinese government has always spent a lot of money on semiconductors. But the thing about Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao is they were also earning money, right? The real estate was developing, the trade was developing, foreign direct investment was coming in, right? So the equation is not going to hold, right? And now you have a whole bunch of choices. One choice is to cut down on the expenditure, cut down on the spending. You give up on the Belt and Road. You give up on the semiconductor. You give up on the big urbanization infrastructure programs. Then you get into balance. Or you start to think about on the income side, how to get economic growth to generate the tax revenue, the financial resources to support the big ticket items that you have. And I believe it will be very hard for the Communist Party to give up on the big programs. And Belt and Road, you actually kind of have to spend money more and more because you have to bail them out. I never believe in Belt and Road, but that's a separate issue. And I wrote about it in 2018. And I argued in the article that in the end, it was going to be the Chinese who are going to hold up the bag, which is happening now. So that's not going to change. Then you have to come back on basic economic sense, which is you need a market economy, you need a trade, you need foreign direct investment. In the last period also, China experienced for the first time a net outflow of foreign direct investment. Has never happened before. Right? Over the last 2 years, the inflow has begun to decrease, has begun to decline. But still, there's more money coming in than the money going out. Now there's more money going out than the money coming in. Right? The consumption is not picking up. The infrastructure program is no longer necessary, really, on objective economic grounds. China has some bright spots like EVs and solars, but let's be honest. Those, you add them up, it's about 6% of the Chinese economy. 25% of the Chinese economy is thinking, right? Okay, you have 6%, which is good, better than 0%. You have 25% going down. Trade, China is losing trade shares to Vietnam, to Mexico, to many other countries in terms of the trade with the United States. Trade is a very important part of the Chinese economy, right? And to have a good trade relationship, you need to repair the political relationship. This is the way that I explain why Xi Jinping is gradually moving in the direction of trying to normalize the relationship with the United States. The economic reality is too stark. Whether you call it self-correction, I don't know, but I believe that many people would have told him that if you are CEO of a company, you don't want to offend your customers, right? U.S. is your customer. And all this talk about the BRICS, the global south, it's pure nonsense. Trade with Russia. Trade Russia, some Chinese commentators say, wow, has increased 60%. Yes, with the U.S. has decreased 6%, but the trade with Russia has increased 60%, 70%. Let's be real. The size of the Russian economy is the size of Guangdong province. It's about $2 trillion. The U.S. imports every year $3.2 trillion. The U.S. import is bigger than the Russian GDP, right? Outside of sort of U.S., Europe, Japan, South Korea, if you add the developed countries together, we're talking about $55 trillion. Russia is $2 trillion. BRICS, Wall Street people would tell you, oh, BRICS replace the U.S. and just sheer nonsense. The BRICS account for maybe 26, 27, 29% of the worldwide GDP. Of that, 25% is Chinese. Okay, let's just be real, right? So the math simply doesn't work in terms of damaging the relationship with the West. The relationship with Australia, I do believe that's a good movement, right? So you begin to repair the relationship with Australia. Hopefully, you repair the relationship with the United States. And hopefully, you repair the relationship with Japan, with South Korea. Well, then we're talking about going back to Hu Jintao era.
But
right?
that does presuppose, Yasheng, that Xi Jinping doesn't continue to see the West as a hostile force.
Yeah. So that's a big if. But again, I think what we should do is we shouldn't write off this automatically. And I personally welcome self-correction or whatever corrections. And I think that's a good. I think a better way for China to move forward is still the 1980s model. You gradually reform, politically, economically, rather than through a revolutionary process. We saw that in Russia. It was Libya. We saw that, right? So it was terrible, right? So I didn't answer the question about Libya. The lesson from Libya is absolute autocrats don't end up very well. That's the lesson. Ceausescu, that's the lesson.
Maybe that's the final benediction here, that autocrats don't end up very well.
Absolute autocrats.
Absolute.
Soft autocrats, they're okay. Jiang Jingguo and Deng Xiaoping.
Xi is as absolute as he can.
Yeah, so that's why I worry. Right? So the Libya example is the example you don't want to happen to yourself.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. Yasheng, thank you so much. Do we have books here? We do. Good. So I would strongly urge you to pick this up. It's a good read. And listen, China's really the only other big dog on the block. So read up. Thank you.
Thank you.